All right. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to begin, hopefully, the final video of this presentation or of this lecture, the fourth and final one. So this is lecture 4 of a 4-part series, it looks like. And we finish up chapter 2 based off chemistry, and then we working our way on chapter 3, which deals with the organic molecules of life, right? So, we said before, remember there's CHON. That is a really important acronym. Those are the 4 elements that make up 96% of living organisms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Of those, the most important is carbon. Because of the way carbon's arranged, remember it has 4 valence electrons. That allows it to interact with a bunch of different types of atoms, and then those can keep interacting and it can form really big complex structures. We talked about organic compounds, right? We're not talking about pesticides and Whole Foods and Aldi's, right? We're talking about organic compounds, or just compounds which are made of carbon, often carbon and hydrogen, but carbon is a requirement that has to have carbon, and that's mostly carbon and mostly hydrogen. Then we said carbon gets to act like this, and it's so versatile is a molecule because it has 4 valence electrons that allows it to bind to the different things like, HO and N, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon itself because of this. And we said here's carbon, it can form a double covalent bond here. And here with oxygen, they both satisfy the octet rule, and same thing down here, and it can do that. And these are some really important molecules: carbon dioxide, the gas you breathe out in the nice bubbles, nice fizzy bubbles, right? In soda, how awesome is that? Or ethanol, like we said here, that is the great, lovely alcohol, which you should drink responsibly, in beer and in different types of spirits and stuff. And then we said there are hydrocarbons. These are different. Hydrocarbons are organic molecules that are mostly carbon and hydrogen. These are important because when you undergo reactions to destroy them, they release energy. They can release energy, right, and help you, move really fast, and help you move and help do your daily products, like dietary fat. That's why we need fats. You shouldn't have a lot of it, but you need it. Or they can help get your car moving, or your Harley bike, or whatever it is, you drive, help get those things moving, or your nice boat helps get those move. And like octane, like we said, is one of the lipids or hydrocarbons, a gas, which you can see there. That's the problem, though. Hydrocarbons can provide lots of energy, but a lot of you don't use that energy. You eat ribs and you eat French fries, but then you sit at home and binge watch Orange is the New Black, right, on Netflix. Or you're at home and, it's raining, so you're watching every episode of The Price is Right, or something, right? So, that's good. All those shows and movies, they're great. But you're eating all that food while you're sitting there watching it, then you're not exercising, and then you'll wonder why, you're starting to gain weight. It's because you eat all these fats and eat all these things that can provide you energy, but you don't use them, so then they get stored, in the fat and as adipose tissue. So then, this is kind of where we left off. So there's also something known as an isomer. An isomer is really weird because isomers are compounds. They have the same molecular formula, but they have different structures and different properties, right? So these here, butane and isobutane, you don't need to memorize this, but these two are isomers. You do need to understand what the word isomer means. They have the same formula, C4H10. They both have 4 carbons and 10 hydrogens, but they have different names and different properties because of the way they're arranged. That's really important. What the heck is an isomer? Here's another picture. Both of these are C2. They have 2 carbons, 2 hydrogens, and 2 chlorines. But they are arranged differently based off where the chlorines, both are up here and both are here. So that actually has different properties. So this is the difference between some in trans fats, and then non-trans fats, which we call cis fats, but trans fats, let's say. But that's just is a form of an isomer. So the important word here is, what is an isomer? It's a compound, 2 compounds that have the same formula, but they're just either arranged differently, they have a different structure, and as a result, now they have different properties. This often happens with medicine. A lot of times, there's a generic and a regular, and they might have mirror images, and those are also called isomers, and so forth. So we gotta look at the crazy eyes here. Don't get confused. You're gonna get confused, and a lot of you miss questions based off these because you did get confused because they all sound the same. But let's do a quick review. What the heck is an isotope? What's an isotope? Right. So an isotope is where you have two atoms of the same element, so they're both carbon, but they differ in the number of neutrons. This one has 6 neutrons, this one has 7, that one has 5. They're isotopes of each other. They're all carbon, but they're just different number of neutrons. What's an ion? So an ion is a charged atom or a charged element, right? So it's whenever there's a different number of protons and electrons. The ones we see on the periodic table, are they ions? Right? So those are elements, those are neutral. So they have the same number of protons and electrons. So how could these numbers be different? Number of protons and electrons. Do atoms gain or lose protons? Or do they gain and lose electrons, or both, or what happens? So they're not going to ever gain or lose a proton. If they did, they'd change an element. Now, technically, we can do that in science, and it's really expensive, and it's pretty crazy and complex. We're not going to get into that. But the reality is what we change, then that would form an ion. It's just weird. But what happens is electrons are moved around, right? You give it to someone, and you take it. You formed a charged atom or charged molecule. If you lose an electron, what charge does that molecule become if you give up an electron? Well, what charge is an electron? Negative, right? So if you give up a negative, then you're becoming more positive. Does anybody remember what a positive ion is known as? A cation, right? And then a negative ion is known as a anion. Very good. Then finally, like we just said, isomer. Isomers are compounds that they have the same formula. They're made of the same elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, all these things, whatever it is. But they have different structures or different properties. They have different structures. They're arranged differently. As a result, that changes their properties. So the boiling point might be different. The way it acts, the way it spins light can be different, and they're different. Also, there's something known as a functional group, and these are important. Functional groups are the really important components of organic molecules. These are the ones involved in chemical reactions. So the way that an organic compound behaves depends on the carbon skeleton and the different atoms attached, like the functional groups. So this is really important. We have 3 really, really important, the most common in my opinion, functional groups, so you need to know these. There's a hydroxyl group, a carboxyl group, and an amino group. And we'll go through all 3 of these, but you should know these. So there's a hydroxyl group. It's made up of an O and an H. So you need to know what is a hydroxyl group. You should kind of be able to draw it. It's just an O and an H. Hydroxyl groups, the OH, they form compounds known as alcohols. So here's ethanol, the lovely alcohol in alcoholic beverages, right? So the OH groups, they form alcohol. So methanol, ethanol, isopropyl alcohol, and so forth, right? Like the different rubbing alcohol and stuff, these different alcohols, they have a OH group on them. They have a hydroxyl group. That's really important. You need to understand what a hydroxyl group looks like. You should be able to identify it. And hydroxyl groups form alcohols. There's a carboxyl group. A carboxyl group is this thing right here. A COOH. A C double bond O, bond OH. This thing here, you should definitely be able to recognize that, because if you see something that has that often forms compounds known as acids. So most acids have this. Hydrochloric acid doesn't have that. That's a little different. But organic acids have these, like acetic acid and so forth. Like right here's a picture of acetic acid, which is why vinegar is sour, right? But carboxyl groups, they form things known as acids, and they look like this. C double bond O, bond OH. And that's really important. You should be able to, identify what they look like, and then know what they form: acids, alcohols, or in this case, a base. So this is an amino group, NH2. Here's a picture of that. And these act as a base. So the amino group, NH2, acts as a base. And that's really, really important to understand. What the heck is a hydroxyl group? It's an OH group that forms alcohol. What's a carboxyl group? C double bond OH. C double bond O bond OH, or COOH, right? Those form acids. What's an amino group? Those form bases, and they look like NH2. So now we do this, and now we're getting to something known as macromolecules. This is where we're going to be looking at today, and then for next class when we meet next Friday. So what are macromolecules? What does macro mean? Macro means big, right? We use a microscope to see small things. We macroscopically use our eyeballs to look at things. Macro means big. So these are really big, complex molecules, right? So all living things are made up of 4 different types of these macromolecules, or large biological molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. These are really, really important, and they all have different properties because of the elements they're made of and the different functional groups and how they're arranged and so forth. Today we're only going to look at carbohydrates, and the next class we'll dive into lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and then move on to chapter 4. So these are really important, and these 3 things are really important components of food, right? People are always trying to watch their carbs or watch their fats and lipids, right? You know, some people want to go on a low protein diet. Some people want protein a lot, so they take protein shakes, right? So before we can get into carbohydrates specifically, we have to look. And we have these 2 terms which you need to commit to memory, or else your brain is going to be melted every time we look at carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, because you're not going to understand the words I'm saying. So you want to look at this. A polymer and a monomer. First, let's break these down. What does mono mean? What does that mean? Some of you are like, kissing disease? Yeah, that's infectious mononucleosis. Let's not think about that though. What does mono mean? I have a monocle, right? A monopoly. One person owns it. Monocle. One. Glass or something. So mono means one. So monomers are the individual units that serve as building blocks to make a polymer. What is a polymer? Poly. What does poly mean? It could be monotheistic, you serve one god, or polytheistic, you have many gods, right? So poly means many. Polymer is a long molecule. It's just one molecule, but it's a long molecule that's made up of many different building blocks. So a polymer is made up of a bunch of monomers. Carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids, those are polymers. Lipids aren't, and I kind of get into that, but that's not too big of an important point. But you want to know monomers are the individual units which make up a long molecule known as a polymer. So this is important because we consume these macromolecules, right? We eat proteins, we eat lipids, we eat carbohydrates. Those are huge. But we have to break it down. We break it down via digestion and all that stuff and chewing, but you have to break it down. You have to break them down so that we can use the individual pieces that make it up. We need to use those monomers, and that's what gives us energy, right? Or we use to build cells and so forth. So to do that, there's 2 processes to make these long chains, the polymers, or destroy them and break them down into their individual units. This is known as dehydration reactions and hydrolysis reactions. So a dehydration reaction builds. It's wherever you join 2 monomers together. So you join, it's where you build a chain or you start lengthening. So here's a short, you join this small unit to this small, and then you form a longer one. And then you have another dehydration reaction where you add another one. And it goes, from being just 4, now it's 5, and now it's 6, and now it's 7, and now it's 8. You're building. Dehydration reactions build. You're joining and putting these pieces together. That's a really important point. Hydrolysis reactions are the opposite. Lysis actually means to destroy or to cut. So hydrolysis reactions, when you do the exact opposite, they destroy. You break down a polymer, you chop off this piece, now you have an individual monomer. Then you do it again, you chop off this piece, now you have an individual monomer. You chop off this piece, and now you have an individual monomer. Hydrolysis reactions are where you disassemble the polymers, the big long chains. You take off one piece at a time, one piece at a time, one piece at a time, one piece at a time. Dehydration reactions you build. You add one piece at a time, you add one piece at a time. It gets longer and longer and longer. And hydrolysis is when you break it down and you get individual units. So our cells are made up of tons of different macromolecules. We have a bunch of different proteins, quite a few different carbohydrates, quite a few different lipids, right? And even though you have these crazy number of polymers, you only have a few monomers to build those with, because it's all based off the arrangement, right? You have a bunch of words, but you only have 26 letters, the monomers, to build those words, long chains, like polymers. So now we're going to start and we're going to begin and we're going to look at carbohydrates, right? So carbohydrates are macromolecules, big molecules. They include sugars in their polymers. So this is really important for each of these, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and all that. You need to learn the monomer and the polymer. So an individual carbohydrate unit, the monomer, is known as a monosaccharide. You then put a bunch of monosaccharides together to make a polysaccharide. So whenever you think of saccharide, you want to think of sugar. Monosaccharide is one individual sugar piece, and then you put them together, and then you form a long carbohydrate, right? That's really important. You need to make sure for these you know what the monomers and the polymers are called. So here, a lot of you eat carbohydrates. Most of you just think of carbohydrates as bread and pasta, right? That's all you think of it. But carbohydrates are sugars. So they're actually carbohydrates, in plants, in vegetables, and in fruits, right? So there are carbohydrates in those, and rice, and potatoes, and there's also, carbohydrates in milk and stuff, but, a smaller amount because there is sugar in milk. But we'll kind of get to that. So a monosaccharide is the individual unit, the monomer of carbohydrates. You build them together and form a polysaccharide. These individual units are the major fuel source for cells, and they're the raw material for when we build molecules. Sugars, carbohydrates, are the major fuels for the cells, especially the brain. So there's 3 monosaccharides you need to know. Here they are: glucose, fructose, and galactose. A lot of you have heard of these two. Maybe you haven't heard of this one, though, galactose. It sounds like lactose, and it's related to it, like we're going to find out. But there are 3 individual units: glucose, fructose, and galactose. A disaccharide is when you combine 2 monosaccharides. You put them together. It's a dehydration reaction, right? You're building. What's that reaction called? Do you remember when you break it apart? A hydrolysis reaction, right? So, monosaccharides are the individual units: glucose, fructose, and galactose. You combine them and you form disaccharides. Here are 3 examples: sucrose, which is the stuff in table sugar; lactose, the sugar in milk; and maltose, the sugar in beer and malt beverages and malt shakes, and malt balls, Whoppers, right? So it's just a combination. Sucrose is glucose and fructose. Put those together, you form sucrose. Lactose is glucose and galactose, right? So it kind of all depends. But these disaccharides are made from monomers, right? 2 monomers. So these names aren't too important. Lactose is an important one, though, and we'll kind of get to why. But you want to make sure you know these 3 monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Know what a monosaccharide is, what the individual unit is, and what the long polymers are called, and we'll get to that. So here's a lactose intolerance. Some of you might be lactose intolerant, right? What does that mean? Does that mean you're allergic to milk? Is that what that means? Some of you are nodding your head and be like, yep, yep, that's me. Allergic to milk. Actually, you're not allergic to milk. If you have lactose intolerance, you're not allergic. You're not gonna, have difficulty breathing. You're not gonna get, inflammation. You're not gonna get that. You don't have that. You just get, bloating and diarrhea, right? Uh, so we'll get to that though. So lactose intolerance is a case where it's a clinical condition, right? It's a disease, I guess you can call it, or disorder, where people who have it, they can't digest lactose. Remember, lactose, a disaccharide, it's the sugar in milk. So they can't break apart lactose. Here's lactose. It's a disaccharide of galactose and glucose put together. They can't break it apart into individual units, the monosaccharides, because they lack something known as lactase. Lactase is an enzyme, it just breaks it down into those two individual units. They don't have enough of that, or they don't make any of it, so they can't break down milk. So they're not going to get the nutrients for milk, but, what's the bad part, right? So what happens is this this lactose then doesn't get built up, or doesn't get broken down, and doesn't get dissolved, broken down, and then absorbed into your blood. So as a result, it goes through your intestines. It attracts water. You have diarrhea. It causes bloating because bacteria. Remember we said you have lots of bacteria in your body. In fact, you're more bacteria than you are, human cells, right? But there is this bacteria eat it. It's like their food, right? We eat pizza. Bacteria love to eat lactose. It's one of the things they like. So they eat it, and then they gotta, release their waste. So they, release gas, and that makes the person bloated, and it has caused them to be gassy and so forth. But this is lactose intolerant. So if you are lactose intolerant, as a lot of you know, it's okay. Drink soy milk. It's okay. Drink almond milk. Almond milk is great. They have cashew milk now. You can drink that. Or you can just take this pill. There's a pill that has this. Now you can just pop a pill, right? And then drink milk and get to enjoy that. How awesome is that? So, like I said, we're in the golden age of biology, right? We're moving forward. And then there's something known as a polysaccharide. A long polymer is the polymer of carbohydrates. It's made of many different monomers of monosaccharides. Any combination of glucose, fructose, and galactose, putting them together in certain orders, gives you different polysaccharides, right? The three main ones you need to know are starch, glycogen, and glucose, so we'll get into those. Here's starch. It's the energy storage polysaccharide in plants. So humans, when we eat lots of carbohydrates, say we eat bread, then we store that carbohydrate somewhere in our body. We store our fat, right, in fat cells. Carbohydrates get stored, and they eventually get stored in our liver, and we'll talk about that. Plants, they don't have a liver, but they store it as starch in their body. So this is an example of starch. It's just made up of tons of glucose individual units. It's a long polymer. So potatoes and grains, they have quite a bit of starch, right? And that's really important. What are the polymers, the polysaccharides for carbohydrates? Starch, glycogen, and cellulose. What is starch? It's the energy storage for plants. That's really important. Glycogen. Glycogen is not the energy storage for plants. It's a polysaccharide of animals. So animals like me and you, and like, good old, Boxer, our dog, right? We store our carbohydrates in our liver and muscles. Then we use those for energy. We use them in our muscles to then run around and move around, and we put them in our liver, and that affects our blood sugar, which is why someone can be a diabetic. We don't really talk about it that much. But we store glycogen, and that's our energy storage molecule for animals like us, and we store it in our liver and muscle cells. Then, whenever we need food, like I ate a bagel, 2 hours ago, and now I need, I'm, kind of getting hungry again. I'm always eating, right? But when you're not eating, you still need to feed your body cells with some sugars. So you break down the stored glycogen in the liver, and then you send it all throughout the blood. So here's glycogen. Here's an actual real microscope picture of of glycogen, you can see the little molecules here, these little black things. You can see them, and that's found in muscle tissue, but it's also found in the bone, right, in humans. So we use this as our energy storage. That's really important to know what is glycogen. And then cellulose is the final one. Some of you were like, I have cellulose. No, no, no. That's cellulite, right? This is something completely different. Cellulose is the structural polysaccharide for plant cells. So it's not for energy, it's for structure. It kind of gives them their wall. It makes up the main component of their tough plant cell wall. We use walls to build up our house. Remember, cells have cell membranes, they have walls. Cellulose makes up the plant cell wall. And that way plants, kind of don't, fall apart and so forth. They kind of stick together. But that's part of their cell wall. That's what cellulose is. It's not for energy, it's for structure. It's the walls. And this here, cellulose, is the most abundant organic compound on Earth. And that's really important. What the heck are the three polysaccharides, long units of sugars or carbohydrates? Starch, which is energy storage in plants. Glycogen, the energy storage in animals, which we store in our liver and muscles, right? And then cellulose, a structural. It doesn't give you energy, it just provides structure for plant cells. It's found in their cell wall. So animals, like us, we have enzymes and we can digest starch. We can break it down and we can get food from it, right? We eat potatoes and we can break it down and we get energy from that starch. But we do not have enzymes to destroy cellulose. We cannot break it down. We can't eat grass and get the energy and nutrients we need from that. We can eat lettuce and we can't break down the cellulose that makes up those plant cell walls. We'll get other nutrients, but we can't get that, right? So as a result, it passes through. Cellulose we can't break down, so it passes through the digestive tract is insoluble fiber, right? That's what produces this. A lot of you are cringing right now. What is that? Chocolate froyo? Not quite, right? So this is feces. And this is made up, look how gooey it is, wow. This person got a nice healthy stool here, right? Anyways, so this is why you have some, substance to this. This is insoluble fiber. This person, ate some kind of plant somehow and it formed this. They eat some, beans. They could have eaten some corn, eaten some, food, and then we couldn't break it down and process it. We couldn't digest it, so it just made its way out. You still need to eat it though, because fiber is really important for digestive health and getting things moving and so forth. So cows, just like humans, they can't digest it. Heck, animals do not have enzymes to digest cellulose. They don't. But a lot of you are like, cows, they eat grass. How do they get any energy from that, right? How do they get energy if all they eat is plants? This is a good question. Cows have bacteria in their stomach. Well, so do we. But they have bacteria in their stomach which know how to digest cellulose. They are able to digest it because they have enzymes. So the actual animal can't, but then there are good bacteria inside of the stomach which do. And they digest it and they break apart the individual units, the monosaccharides. And then that cow then gets the energy from it. So here's a nice image of this that shows you all the polysaccharides. What are the polysaccharides? The long units of carbohydrates. Starch, found like potatoes and rice and stuff. The long units. And it's energy for plants. Storage energy for plants. Glycogen, the storage energy for animals found in our liver and muscle cells. Cellulose, a structural. So it makes up the structure, gives it the way it looks. It makes up that cell wall, the most abundant compound on Earth, cellulose. Humans can't digest it. Animals can't digest it. Even cows can't, but they have enzymes that can and do. So now we're done. We're all finished with this chapter. So it's really important. It seems like a lot, and it is a lot, and I get it. But you want to remember, you need to make sure you know what the heck is a monomer and what's a polymer. Monomers are the individual units which make up the polymer, the long chain. Then for every one of these, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, you need to know what the individual units are and what the, bigger polymers are. We're only going to get to carbohydrates, which we talked about, You see, no, the monosaccharides are known as the monomers of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. Can you remember any monosaccharide names? Glucose, fructose, and galactose, right? Combine those, get disaccharides like lactose, maltose, and sucrose. And then you put a bunch of these monomers, a bunch of these monosaccharides, and you get polysaccharides like starch, like glycogen, and like cellulose. So this is a really good point to stop. And then we will pick it up next class, live in class, and then we're going to then begin, I believe we're going to be working on lipids, or the next one, I believe. So make sure you go through this. Make sure you read. This is the fourth and final video. Make sure you look over this. Look over all of them. Somewhere you were like, oh, all he does is read off the PowerPoints anyways, right? I'm just going to do that myself. Okay, and you can do that. And you might do just as well as anyone else. But from what I've seen, the students who are going to go on here and look at this, they're definitely going to do the best. Those of you that are reading the chapter, you guys are going to do even better. Because there's a lot of material, and the more you look over it, the more you look over it, the more you look over it, the easier it gets, because it's complex. So you want to make sure you go over this. Flashcards are going to be your savior, right, for this. You're going to love them, because you can just put on there, what is a monosaccharide? Name 3 of them, and so forth. What is starch? What is glycogen? These are going to be really good things for flashcards, so I highly recommend you do that. So that's it. And we'll pick it up next class. And hope you enjoyed your vacation, or not really vacation, the small break. Hopefully no one got swept away, by good old Hurricane Hermine. All right, see you next class.